The elevator smelled of burning, as if cables were melting right behind the metal wall. A woman passing by noticed that the light on the panel was flashing, even though the intercom screen had long since stopped working. The camera above the elevator, on the other hand, was glowing with a steady green light, even though it had been turned off that morning. Hello, friends. This is the Evening Stories channel. Make yourselves comfortable, right where you are listening to us from, and don't forget, the more closely you look at everyday life, the scarier it becomes. Enjoy listening. Martha took off her slippers at the door and put her grocery bag on the floor. The apartment smelled of wet concrete. The neighbors were shutting off the water again. The water flowed intermittently, and the heating came on in bursts. Her husband, Nikolai, was sitting in the kitchen in a t-shirt with a bottle of dark beer and a piece of paper that looked like an old charter, a seal, signatures, uneven lines. He said that now everything in the house would be by the rules, because that's how it's done in their family. Martha thought this was another flare-up of his strange fascination with the old days, but then she saw that he had hung the sheet above the table like an icon. The text was called Domestic Statute on Obedience. The paper listed the rights of the head of the family and the duties of the spouse. Nikolai assured her that the document had been found in old archives, that his grandfather had signed something similar when he lived in the village. The words were archaic. Any disobedience in the affairs of the household will lead to punishment. At first it seemed funny. Then it seemed awkward. When he began to refer to this sheet seriously, it became alarming. She did not argue, but made notes in her notebook. Who was there when he attached the letter? What he said. She thought it would pass, like his other oddities, collecting hereditary keys, stories about the family line, about the pure lineage. But the letter did not disappear. On the contrary, Nikolai began to demand that she report according to the statute. For the first few weeks, Marta simply left for work early and returned later. But one evening, when she returned after her shift, she saw a small envelope without a stamp or address in the mailbox. Inside was a copy of the same statute, only printed on a modern printer, without a seal, but with the signature, "I approve." She did not know who could have planted it there. In the residents' chat room, they discussed similar oddities. Someone found printouts of instructions for spouses under their doors. Someone else found sheets with house rules. No one admitted to doing it. The chat administrator asked everyone not to panic and blamed it on a prankster. But an old Neva stood under the windows of the house with its lights on, and the engine was running even at night. Martha then called an acquaintance for the first time, Father Paul from the local parish. He had known Nikolai since childhood and had baptized his nephew. She asked if there was anything like household statutes in the church archives. The priest was surprised, said that nothing of the sort existed, and promised to look through the documents. A day later, he called and said that they had found nothing of the sort in the city archives. Then he suggested meeting, but Nikolai did not let his wife go to the church, stating that according to the charter, the husband decides where the wife goes. A neighbor from the 5th floor, a pensioner named Margarita Ivanovna, said that Nikolai had previously been involved in a conflict over a debt. A relative accused his father of forging family documents. This seemed trivial to Marta until she noticed that the signature on the charter appeared to be in the same handwriting as Nikolai's surname in his old passport. She made a copy of the sheet and showed it to a clerk she knew from the administration, Sergei, who helped people file complaints and applications. He looked at it and said that the document was not registered anywhere and did not even have a standard registration number. On the back, there were traces of glue, as if someone had removed someone else's seal and stuck a new one on. He suggested quietly checking its authenticity. Marta agreed, but asked him not to call her home. Her husband was checking her phone. A week later, Nikolai began to say that betrayal had appeared in the house. He removed the surveillance camera from the stairwell and placed it in the bedroom, explaining that he wanted to protect the house from lies. Since then, Marta had been sleeping poorly. Sometimes in the middle of the night, she heard the camera clicking quietly, as if it were taking pictures. Sometimes she woke up from the light of the screen. The camera flashed even when it was turned off. She began to notice recurring details. Someone left small coins under the rug by the elevator, as if paying for something. There was a burning smell coming from the garbage chute. The stickers on the mailboxes began to change. Numbers appeared instead of surnames, as if the box numbers had been replaced. When she asked the concierge, he said he didn't know anything, but then complained that someone had forged his signature in the duty log. One morning, Sergei, the clerk, called an alarm. The document he was checking turned out to be based on a template from an old private society from the pre-revolutionary era of family contracts, with no legal force. The seal was fake. But the strangest thing was that the form was registered to the name of a person who had died 20 years ago. That same evening, there was a knock at Marta's door. Standing outside were two men, Nikolai's brother and a neighbor. They brought a bottle and said they wanted to have a friendly chat. She heard the elevator humming downstairs. The smell of burning was in the air again. The men behaved calmly, but said that it is not customary in the family to air dirty laundry in public. It became clear to Marta that the conversation would not be about peace. She went into the bathroom and quietly sent a message to Sergei and Father Pavel. "If I don't get in touch tomorrow, check the archive and the address." Then she hid her phone in a jar of cereal. At night, Nikolai wrote something in a notebook, long lists with a sum next to each name. In the morning, the sheet with the statute disappeared, and in its place hung a new, shorter one, where the first point was, "Obedience requires no explanation." She realized that something bad was about to happen and decided to take action, to find the original document, which, according to Sergei, was supposed to be kept in the archive under the attic of the old administration building. That day, the elevator stopped between floors. In the darkness, she heard someone breathing behind the wall. Then there was a quiet tapping, as if someone were tapping on the cabin with a pencil. When the lights came back on, there was a scratched inscription on the wall, "Check the signatures." Martha got out and walked. It was snowing outside, and steam rose from under the cars. The archive smelled of paper and dust. The employee on duty asked for her last name and leafed through the log for a long time. One of the folders did indeed contain a document with a similar title, but it was dated from the recent past, not the century before last. The signatory column contained the name Nikolai and the signature of Sergei, the clerk. She couldn't believe her eyes at first. Sergei insisted that he hadn't signed anything, but the signature was his, exactly the same as on the application she had given him. Then she realized that someone had replaced the form, and if he had participated by accident, he was now involved in forgery. She took a photo of the sheet and hid her phone back in the cereal box. When she returned home in the evening, she saw that the camera in the bedroom had been removed, but in its place was a box from a hard drive. Inside was a flash drive and an unsigned note. "Open in the temple." The flash drive was encrypted, but Father Pavel, who received it the next day, managed to open the files. There were copies of receipts, audio recordings, and even photos from surveillance cameras. All this proved that Nikolai had been blackmailing his neighbors by sending them statutory fines, fake notices on behalf of the community. When this information was passed on to the magistrate, everything quickly fell apart. Nikolai tried to portray himself as a victim of malicious interference, but the cameras in the stairwell and the printouts of the transfers showed otherwise. No one knew who exactly brought Marta the flash drive. The recordings showed a man in old priestly vestments, but his face was covered. By morning, the intercom code had been changed. The smell of smoke was gone. Only the camera above the elevator was still flashing, even though its power had been turned off. Martha stood at the window for a long time. People were coming up from below. Some of the residents were carrying cats in their arms. Others were carrying folders with papers. The world looked peaceful, but inside her there was a silence like ashes. At that moment, she realized that justice sometimes comes without fanfare. It simply gives back their breath to those who have been silent for a long time. When the noise around the statute began to subside, it seemed as if everything had finally calmed down. Martha went to work, stopped flinching at the footsteps in the stairwell, and even the light in the elevator stopped flickering. Nikolai temporarily left to visit his brother to sort things out, and for the first time in months the house was quiet. Only at night, when she put the kettle on, did she hear a slight crackling in the radiators, as if someone were slowly moving metal inside the walls. The priest, Father Pavel, suggested that she file a petition for the court to officially recognize the statute as fraudulent. Martha hesitated at first. She didn't want to go through explanations and interrogations again. But after a piece of paper with the text, "Domestic Statute on the Obedience of Wives," appeared in her mailbox again, she realized that it was not over yet. This copy was different. It had a new signature, neat and feminine. It was signed on behalf of the Council of Good Homes. There was no address, no stamp, but the paper looked fresh, with a slight smell of toner and other people's hands. She remembered the flash drive, the one someone had left that night. In one of the recordings, the silhouette of a woman flashed by, short, wearing a dark coat and a red scarf. She was leaving an envelope under Nikolai's apartment door. At the time, Martha hadn't thought much of it, but now she felt that the trail led there. Sergei, the clerk, helped her fill out the application. He looked tired. After the whole story, he had been called in for questioning and was facing disciplinary action. But he didn't back down, saying that such papers are multiplying like mushrooms, and that somewhere there was a master who was printing them. He noticed that all the copies had the same mistake. Instead of the letter O in the word domovoi, there was a Latin letter, slightly narrower than usual. This meant that the template had been typed using an old, unlicensed font. "The trail can be traced to the printer," he said. Martha brought copies of all the letters and a flash drive to the magistrate. The investigator was surprised. They had several such cases. All of them featured fake statutes and domestic codes, as if someone had tried to introduce private rules to justify violence and debts. Most of the victims were women who were afraid to report the crimes. At this stage, a person whom no one expected to hear about entered the story. A young lawyer from the community center, a former student of Father Pavel's, named Alexei. He volunteered to help for free, citing the fact that his mother had once lived under a similar charter and died in a house where one person decided everything. He took it upon himself to find the source of the fake documents. To Marta, he seemed quiet and almost invisible. He spoke briefly, listened attentively, and often asked her to remember small details: what the paper smelled like, where she kept it, who had seen the sheet before others. These questions seemed pointless, until one day she brought Nikolai's old notebook, the very one where he wrote down his finds. On the last page, there was a watermark, the logo of the local printing house where Alexei had previously done an internship. He went there and found out that a few months ago they had indeed received an order. Old-fashioned forms, archaic font, a request to age the paper. The customer gave the surname Demidov, but the documents listed a phone number that matched Nikolai's brother's number. This detail became the first solid piece of evidence. Meanwhile, Martha increasingly noticed that she seemed to be being watched. Her phone was warm, even when it wasn't connected to the network. Sometimes at night, if she went to the window, she could see the glowing screen of a laptop in the dark windows of the neighboring house. It seemed as if someone was taking notes. She told Sergei about it, and he brought a small radio detector. He checked the apartment but found nothing. Only near the camera that had been removed from the wall did the device beep, as if it was picking up a signal. Under the wallpaper, there was a tiny transmitter disguised as a piece of plastic. Marta realized that the surveillance had been going on from the inside, from the very beginning. Alexei insisted that this be included in the case file. He suggested that the transmitter could have been sold together with the camera on the internet, and then it would be possible to track down the supplier. But the serial number showed that the device was handmade, without registration. Someone had assembled it by hand. The next step was unexpected. When Alexei submitted the materials to the magistrate, a letter arrived from the Council of Good Houses, signed on behalf of several residents of neighboring houses. They demanded not to interfere in the private affairs of families and to respect ancient traditions. Attached to the letter were photocopies of statutes, all identical, only with different signatures. It looked like an attempt to exert pressure. But it was precisely because of this letter that the case became public. Journalists began to ask questions, and the city prosecutor's office ordered an investigation into the family statutes. That evening, Nikolai returned without warning, carrying a suitcase and some papers. He looked exhausted and said that everyone had misunderstood and that he only wanted to maintain order. Marta didn't know whether to believe him, but at night she heard him whispering to someone on the phone, saying, "They've gone to press. We have to stop them." The next morning, there was a fire at the magistrate's office, a small one, but the archive with the files was damaged. The cabinet where the materials on the house statutes were kept burned down. The firefighters said it was a short circuit, but Alexei showed them photographs, traces of an incendiary mixture, not a wire. Elk, that in this smoke, all attempts to explain why ordinary paper can destroy a life melt away. She felt not fear, but a weary realization. Evil does not always come with a knife, more often with a signature and the words, "I approve." After the fire, Nikolai disappeared. His suitcase was found in the basement of the house, next to an empty box of documents. On the lid were traces of soot and a palm print. His belongings were not taken. The police left a report and left. Martha tried to return to normal life. She worked, cooked, washed the floors, and every day she noticed new little things. The key in the lock became harder to turn, as if someone was trying it from the inside. A shadow appeared under the cupboard in the kitchen, like the movement of a wire, even though there was no light there. And then there was that smell of burning, which seemed long forgotten, returning in the evening when she put the kettle on. One evening, Sergei came to see her. He looked pale, his hands trembling from exhaustion. He said that Alexei had found something strange. On one of the discs that had survived the fire, there was a backup copy of all the statements and letters from the Council of Good Homes. The sender field contained the same email address, registered to a woman named Demidova. "This can't be a coincidence," he said. "It seems that Nikolai's brother wasn't acting alone." But the strangest thing was that when Alexei tried to log into the account, the system requested confirmation from the phone that had once been registered to Nikolai himself. This meant that the council was a fiction created within their family. A few days later, Alexei called, excited. He had received a court order, temporarily declaring all such house statutes null and void. This was the first official reaction, a victory, albeit a partial one. Marta just wanted to sleep. For the first time in many weeks, she fell into a deep sleep. But during the night, she woke up to the quiet rustling of paper. An envelope lay in the hallway near the door. No name, no return address. Inside was only a sheet of paper with a short phrase, "You have violated the family charter." She crumpled the paper without opening it again and threw it in the trash. In the morning, The envelope was lying under the door again. The paper was the same, only with one line added. Last warning. Then Martha picked up her phone, turned on the recording, and filmed the door. When she rewound it, she saw that at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, someone was standing in front of the door. The figure did not move or knock. It just stood there holding a piece of paper. A minute later, it disappeared, but the shadow continued to move across the wall, as if someone else was still in the hallway. Sergei, seeing the recording, said that it could be a reflection from the monitor or the light from the phone. But in the reflection, you can see a cross on a chain, exactly like the one Father Pavel wore. The next morning, Marta went to the church, but the doors were closed, and there was a sign on the door saying, "The parish is temporarily suspended for technical reasons." A neighbor said that Father Pavel had left on internal business and had not returned. Meanwhile, Alexei continued his work. It turned out that most of the fake statutes were printed in the basement of one of the old houses, where the parish printing house archive used to be located. When they arrived there with a warrant, they found a table, an old printer, and several folders marked "Via the Spiritual Department." The papers were half empty, but in one of them they found a list of names, all women against whom the household statutes had been used. Among them was Marta. The most disturbing thing was that at the bottom of the list was the name Pavel, signature illegible. Marta felt sick. She realized that the person she trusted could be part of this network. Alexei, seeing her condition, promised to see it through to the end. He spoke calmly, but his eyes were like those of people who understand that this is no longer just a case. It is a knot tied around all the participants. In the evening, she received a phone call. The voice was distorted, but the phrase was clear. "You have sealed your fate." She turned off the phone and put it in the closet. At that moment, a green dot flashed on the screen of the camera connected to the house, the same one that had previously blocked the elevator. That night, she smelled smoke again. Only now it wasn't coming from the elevator, but from under the door. She rushed to the hallway, but there was no smoke or traces of it. Only a small metal token, with the number 3 engraved on it, lay on the floor. She had never seen such tokens before. The next morning, Alexei announced that the court had scheduled a hearing, exactly 3 days after his call. She kept the token in her pocket as a sign, as if someone was trying to warn her. At the hearing, she sat opposite Nikolai. He remained silent. Next to him, his brother, the same Demidov, assured everyone that it was all for the sake of preserving family values. The judge listened in silence. Alexei presented evidence, records, forgeries, archival receipts. When he mentioned the priest's name, there was a rustle in the courtroom. It turned out that Father Pavel had arrived himself, with new papers. He looked older, but calm. He said he was ready to testify. He explained that when he first heard about the household charter, he decided to check the old archives and stumbled upon the fact that someone had used his signature to register fictitious documents. To stop this, he contacted those who were distributing the forgeries and, undercover, tried to expose them. It was he who planted the flash drive on Marta. He couldn't act otherwise without giving himself away. This confession changed everything. The court declared all household statutes null and void, and their use an abuse of private law. The ruling used the expression penalty for violence under the guise of tradition for the first time. But that wasn't the end of the story. When Martha returned home after the hearing, she saw that the door was ajar. Everything inside was in its place, except for one thing. The sheet of paper above the table, the very same charter, had disappeared. In its place hung a blank sheet of paper. Only at the bottom was there a palm print in soot, familiar from Nikolai's suitcase. She ran her finger over the mark and felt a vibration under her skin, as if something had turned on again behind the wall. The neighboring house was dark, but a red scarf flashed for a second in the window opposite, the same one that the woman in the video had been wearing. Martha closed the curtains. Someone outside turned on an alarm, and the sound faded away. She knew this wasn't the end. Everything official, everything legal, was over. But behind it all remained a network of people who believed that paper was stronger than people. She took the token, placed it on the windowsill, and felt calm for the first time in a long time, because now the fear had become tangible. It could be seen, recorded, analyzed, and that meant it could be defeated once and for all someday. Downstairs, by the elevator, the green light flashed again. The last few weeks had dragged on like after a fire, quietly, but with the smell of smoke in the air. Martha hardly spoke to her neighbors. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with pity. The camera under the ceiling of the entrance no longer flashed, but if you listened carefully, you could hear a faint, barely audible buzzing, as if someone had turned the power back on. She tried not to pay attention. Alexei reported that Nikolai had disappeared after the trial. He was nowhere to be found, neither in hospitals nor at the police station. Demidov's brother received a suspended sentence and a fine, and the printing house was closed. Father Pavel returned to his duties, but spoke little, as if carrying a burden that could not be shared in words. One evening, while Martha was washing the dishes, there was a quiet ring, short, as if someone had accidentally touched the button. She went out into the hallway. No one was there. Only a white envelope lay on the floor. No name, no stamp, just a faint smell of smoke. Inside was not a letter, but a photograph. It was of her, asleep, taken as if from above. In the background, you could see the edge of the table and her hand with that very token. She stared at the picture for a long time. The room became stuffy. It wasn't fear that made it hard to breathe, but the feeling that someone still thought they had the right to control her peace. 2 days later, Alexei called, excited. They had found an additional disc in the archive that had not been damaged by the fire. It contained video files recorded by internal cameras in the houses where the statutes were distributed. And in almost every video, the same woman appeared, short, wearing a red scarf. She handed over folders, left letters, and sometimes envelopes. In one of the frames, Alexei noticed her handing a document to Nikolai, and behind her, the silhouette of a man in a cassock. Marta felt cold. Pavel had said that he acted alone. She drove to the church. The doors were open, and inside it was dimly lit and smelled of wax. Father Pavel stood at the altar, not turning around. She came closer. On the table in front of him lay a thick folder labeled Evidence of Family Peace. He said that these were the remnants of an old program that he had tried to implement before all the events, a project for reconciling spouses which used standard contract templates. When he found out that they had been distorted and turned into an instrument of power, he wanted to destroy everything, but someone beat him to it. The woman with the scarf was his former assistant, who had decided to restore order in her own way. Her name was Anna Demidova. That surname hit her like a bolt of lightning. Marta remembered. The list on the fake statutes included Council of Good Homes, D. Pavel admitted that he had tried to protect his assistant, hoping that she would come to her senses. But now she had disappeared, and the records showed that she was the one who had distributed the latest papers. In the evening, Martha returned home and decided to check the archives herself for the first time. On the flash drive she had kept, she found a hidden folder. Inside was an audio file, short, 6 seconds long, breathing, and a phrase in a woman's voice. They don't understand that the house is above the law. This phrase kept running through her head when the lights went out in the house. First, the automatic switch clicked, Then the batteries hissed. In the silence, she heard footsteps in the stairwell. A faint knock. One, then another. Martha went to the peephole. No one was outside. But downstairs, by the elevator, the green light flashed again. She knew that if she stayed, the story would never end. She gathered her documents, phone, and badge and went outside. The night was quiet, but a light flashed in the windows of the neighboring building, row after row, as if someone were walking floor by floor. Alexei caught up with her at the intersection. He said he had found the last link. The printing house where the statutes were printed belonged to the same parish, but was registered to a third party, Anna Demidova herself. She had died 3 years ago. The fire in the archive started on the very date of her death. At that moment, Martha realized that there was no conspiracy in the network in the usual sense. It was not a cult or an organization. It was a habit, an old, hereditary habit, passed down through paper, signatures, and a habit of obedience. People who were convinced that order could be secured with a seal. She stood under a streetlight, and in its light, the shadow of the badge on her palm trembled as if from her breath. Alexei suggested seeing it through to the end, filing a claim for compensation with the court, so that the precedent would remain in history. She agreed, but asked for one thing: never to call it a case again. When she returned home, the elevator was working. No smell of burning, no flickering. Only when the doors closed did the relay click briefly, as if someone had whispered, "Free." Several weeks passed. Martha laughed again, baked bread, and put flowers in a vase. But in the kitchen, between the pages of an old notebook, she found something she didn't remember: a piece of paper with a palm print and the line "Statute canceled." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but even. She didn't throw the piece of paper away. She simply put it in a frame and placed it by the entrance. Not as a reminder, but as proof that the house now belonged to those who breathed freely. And below, under the porch, a frayed wire swayed in the wind and rang softly, as if somewhere deep inside the wall there remained an electric whisper of the old world, trying to regain its power, but finally losing it. And this time, the green light no longer flashed.